Imagine gripping a rifle so cold the metal burns your hands. Your boots are stiff with ice, your stomach empty, and the order clear. No fires, no light, no sound. One mistake, and the cold finishes what the enemy started. For soldiers in World War II, this wasn't exaggeration. It was daily reality. Nights stretched endlessly in frozen trenches, where the silence was broken only by shivering breath and the groan of ice underfoot. Supplies ran out, fires were forbidden, and still the orders were to hold the line. To endure, they fought a second war, not against bullets, but against winter itself. Out of desperation came invention. They created survival hacks no civilian ever saw, tricks buried in mud, shared in whispers, and passed from one frostbitten hand to another. Some were written on scraps of paper, hidden in pockets. Most were never recorded at all. Some were brilliant. Some were desperate. And some were so closely guarded, they died with the men who relied on them. But every single one carried the same truth. Survival was not about strength, but about ingenuity. Today, those secrets return. Because when comfort collapses, and when systems fail, these lost methods may be the only line between endurance and surrender. Subscribe now, and reclaim the resilience that history tried to erase. Number 1. Clay-sealed food caches. In war, hunger always arrived before the enemy. Supply lines broke, trains vanished under bombing raids, and rations were stolen before they ever reached the front. Soldiers learned quickly that survival didn't depend on bravery in combat. It depended on whether you had something to eat tomorrow. Yet keeping food safe in occupied territory was almost impossible. Rats swarmed ruins. Neighbors whispered for scraps, and enemy patrols searched every attic and cellar. A loaf of bread was as dangerous to hold as a weapon. The solution was neither elegant nor modern. It was buried beneath the earth itself. Soldiers began sealing food inside clay-lined pits, turning soil into storage and mud into armor. At first glance, it looked crude, almost laughable. But beneath the surface, these caches outlasted hunger, rodents, and even detection by enemy troops. The method began with a shallow hole dug in shaded ground, often near ruined barns, abandoned orchards, or beneath the roots of collapsed trees. Rations were placed inside containers, jars if they had them, sometimes just wrapped in cloth. Then came the key: thick layers of clay. Each item was sealed completely, coated until air and insects were locked out. Once hardened, the clay formed a natural vault. Even moisture from rain struggled to seep inside. Soldiers learned to disguise these caches with fallen leaves or scattered rubble. No one looking casually at the ground could guess what lay below. And unlike wooden crates or simple holes, clay didn't smell of food. Dogs and scavengers walked past without pause. A jar of beans or a hunk of dried bread could wait weeks, sometimes months, before being recovered. But this wasn't perfection. Clay cracked in freezing winters, and if handled carelessly, one broken seal ruined everything inside. Digging too often risked exposure, and patience was mandatory. Retrieving food meant carefully breaking away hardened earth with bare hands, knowing one mistake could destroy what little you had. Still, these caches meant survival in silence. A soldier could march into battle with nothing in his pack, knowing that somewhere, beneath layers of dirt and clay, tomorrow's strength was waiting. Would you trust the ground beneath your feet to guard your food today? If you think knowledge like this should never vanish again, remember, every forgotten method is a lifeline waiting to be claimed. Number 2, helmet water purifiers. Thirst was always more dangerous than bullets. A soldier could fight on an empty stomach, but without water, every step became a weight, every breath a struggle. Wells were poisoned, rivers were contaminated, and even puddles near trenches shimmered with disease. To drink directly meant risking dysentery, typhoid, or worse, an illness more crippling than any wound. Yet canteens emptied fast, and no one could wait for supply lines that might never arrive. What they had was not a laboratory, not a filter, not modern equipment. What they had was a helmet. That curved steel, designed to catch shrapnel, became something else entirely. A purifier, a vessel for boiling life back into safety. The technique was shockingly direct. Helmets were scrubbed clean, rinsed of mud and blood, then placed carefully over small fires shielded from enemy sight. Contaminated water scooped from rivers, puddles, even melted snow was poured inside. The shape of the helmet worked almost like a kettle. Heat spread evenly through the metal, bringing liquid to a rolling boil. A few minutes at that violent temperature was enough to kill parasites, neutralize bacteria, and turn something lethal into something drinkable. Sometimes stones or sticks were arranged around the fire to cradle the helmet, lifting it above flames without tipping. Other times, helmets were balanced across two rifles or dug into the earth for stability. Soldiers improvised handles with cloth strips to pour the scalding water into flasks, mugs, or even hollowed wood containers. It wasn't elegant, but it saved lives again and again. Still, the method carried risk. Too much heat warped the steel, weakening the very protection soldiers needed on their heads. A dented helmet was survivable, a cracked one was not. Firelight could betray a position if it flickered too brightly, and smoke from wet wood could drift where it wasn't wanted. Every purification was a gamble between being seen and being safe. But even with those limits, this adaptation became a symbol of resilience. The same object meant to shield a skull from death became the reason a body kept moving, the reason a unit could march another day. It was proof that survival depended not on what you were given, but on what you were willing to transform. Would you look at a simple helmet the same way again? When everything else disappears, survival may not come from advanced tools, but from the ordinary gear already in your hands. Number 3, charcoal tooth cleanser disease taken down more men in history than steel ever did. In the trenches and camps of World War II, soldiers understood this bitter truth firsthand. Rotten teeth, infected gums, and foul breath were not minor inconveniences. They were gateways to infections that could cripple a fighter or force him from the line. But in war zones stripped of supplies, toothbrushes were broken luxuries, and toothpaste was almost mythical. Medical kits rarely reached beyond the wounded. Hygiene had to be forged from the ground itself. The answer came from the remains of fire charcoal, not the kind sold in packets, not factory-made briquettes, but the blackened wood left smoldering after a soldier's cookfire. What seemed like ash and waste became one of the most versatile purifiers known to man. Soldiers crushed it between stones, ground it into fine powder, and carried small cloth bundles of it in their packs. At first glance, it looked crude, but its effectiveness was undeniable. To clean their teeth, they would dip a wet cloth, a twig, or even a fingertip into the powder. The gritty particles scrubbed away plaque, stains, and food residue, far rougher than soap, yet safer than sand. The porous structure of charcoal absorbed odors, trapped bacteria, and reduced the sour taste of neglect. In some accounts, soldiers mixed the powder with a drop of water until it became a paste, rubbing it directly along their gums to fight swelling and reduce pain. It wasn't just for the mouth. Charcoal was pressed onto shallow cuts and abrasions as a crude antiseptic. Its absorptive power drew out moisture and filth, creating a barrier against infection when no bandage or iodine was available. It didn't heal, but it bought time, and time in war was often the difference between returning home and being buried in foreign soil. Of course, this method had limits. Charcoal ground too coarsely damaged enamel, leaving teeth weaker in the long term. Powder applied too often made gums bleed, and for serious infections, it could do little more than slow the inevitable. Yet for thousands, it was enough to keep mouths functional, pain manageable, and morale intact. Soldiers learned that hygiene wasn't vanity. It was endurance. The small ritual, rubbing black dust across teeth in the dark of night, became a private act of defiance against decay. In a world where everything was stolen, even health, They fought to keep something clean, something alive. Would you reduce firewood to powder if it meant saving your teeth? Or would you gamble with the slow march of infection? History already shows what choice they made and why they survived long enough to tell it. Number 4. Button compass disguise. A soldier lost in hostile territory had no greater enemy than confusion. Ammunition might still be in his pouch, strength still in his body, but without direction, every step risked leading him deeper into danger. Maps tore, landmarks burned, and stars vanished behind smoke. Compasses, those tiny instruments of survival, were prime targets for confiscation. Captured with one, and suspicion immediately followed. Yet without navigation, survival dissolved into wandering blind. Soldiers needed a way to carry guidance hidden in plain sight. The solution lay on their own uniforms, buttons. Something so ordinary, so easily overlooked, became one of the cleverest survival tools of the war. Specially prepared buttons were magnetized, balanced, and polished to point north. Disguised as nothing more than clothing, they could be detached in seconds and used as secret compasses when no one was watching. The process was surprisingly subtle. A standard metal button was magnetized by stroking it repeatedly with a lodestone, or even rubbing against another magnetized steel object. Once prepared, one face of the button was marked faintly. A scratch, a dent, or a tiny notch invisible to casual eyes. To use it, soldiers floated the button on a leaf, a sliver of cork, or even a scrap of paper placed on still water. Slowly, it turned, aligning itself with the Earth's magnetic field. That barely noticeable notch would settle, pointing north. For soldiers behind enemy lines, this tiny trick was priceless. It required no bulky tools, no suspicious equipment, and no obvious signs of preparation. In prisoner of war escapes, men sewed these disguised compasses into their coats, replacing ordinary buttons with instruments of freedom. Resistance fighters in occupied cities carried them silently, walking past checkpoints while guards searched for weapons but ignored clothing. Still, the method was delicate. Strong winds on open water disturbed the floating button. Magnetic interference from nearby metal sometimes shifted its alignment, and repeated use weakened its magnetization, requiring it to be prepared again. It was not flawless, not precise, and certainly not fast. But in a world where a wrong turn meant capture or death, even a crude reading of north could be enough. The brilliance of this trick was not the science, it was the invisibility. What every guard dismissed as decoration became salvation. What looked like nothing was, in truth, direction itself. It blurred the line between ordinary life and survival, proving that the smallest, quietest details could decide fate. Would you ever suspect that a button might carry the power to guide someone home? Or that something so forgettable could mean the difference between capture and escape? In war, survival wasn't about weapons in hand. It was about secrets stitched to your chest. Number 5. Pencil. Gunpowder matches. Cold rain and damp forests stripped fire from men long before the enemy did. In World War II, soaked uniforms clung to skin, rifles jammed with mud, and spirits sank as the night dragged on without warmth. A dry flame was more valuable than food, more precious than sleep, yet striking sparks into wet tinder often meant nothing but smoke. Without fire, meals rotted, hands froze, and morale collapsed. Soldiers needed ignition that worked when everything else failed. The solution emerged from an unlikely tool of school children and clerks: pencils. Those splinters of wood that once carried words became weapons against cold and despair. By hollowing their centers and packing them with fine powder from ammunition, soldiers created makeshift matches that could catch flame in conditions where ordinary sparks died instantly. The method required patience and nerve. First, a pencil was carved carefully, its graphite core removed in fragments. Into that narrow cavity went salvaged gunpowder, sometimes scraped from a broken round, sometimes shaken loose from defective cartridges. The powder was tamped gently, never pressed too tightly, to prevent premature ignition. A sliver of cloth or paper was then inserted as a fuse, protruding slightly from the pencil's edge. When touched with a sarg, the fuse carried flame directly into the powder. The burst of heat set the pencil wood alight, transforming it into a torch capable of lighting stubborn fires. The brilliance of this hack lay not in size but in control. Unlike loose powder that flashed violently, the pencil confined it, channeling heat into a steady burn. It didn't explode in the hand, at least not when prepared with care. Soldiers kept bundles of these improvised matches wrapped in oilcloth, ready to strike when rain drowned every other option. In ruined basements, resistance fighters sparked them against stone walls to light concealed stoves. In winter forests, patrols crouched around them, coaxing tiny flames into life beneath soaked branches. But it was never without danger. Mishandled powder could ignite too quickly, burning fingers before firewood caught. A pencil, overstuffed, risked splitting violently, sending shards into the air. And every preparation demanded absolute focus. One mistake meant losing not just the tool, but possibly the hand that made it. These matches were never safe, never reliable for the careless. They worked because desperation demanded precision. Yet their very existence revealed something powerful. In a world stripped of convenience, where storms and warfare erased every comfort, men carved survival out of ordinary objects. A pencil, once meant to record orders or letters home, became the bridge between freezing silence and the glow of fire. Would you dare to hollow a pencil if your survival depended on flame? Or would you sit in the dark, waiting for warmth that would never arrive? In war, hesitation meant suffering, and ingenuity meant life. Number 6. Candle heat tins. Winter didn't just chill the bones in World War II, it crushed morale. Soldiers huddled in ruined buildings, their breath clouding the air, fingers stiff enough to fail their weapons. Fireplaces and stoves were luxuries. Visible smoke was a death sentence, and fuel was always scarce. Cold was not an inconvenience. It was an enemy that claimed strength long before combat ever began. The answer came from something so small it seemed laughable: a tin can and a stub of candle. Together, they became a pocket heater, radiating warmth silently, invisibly, without betraying position. The method was simple but brilliant. A used food tin was cleaned, its inner walls darkened with soot or left bare. A short candle, often scavenged from bombed churches or salvaged from ration supplies, was set inside. When lit, the flame burned steadily, the tin acting like both shield and reflector. Heat that would normally vanish into the air was contained, concentrated, and radiated outward. Some soldiers placed stones around the tin, letting them absorb the warmth and release it slowly through the night. Others pierced tiny holes in the sides, creating vents that improved airflow and kept the flame alive longer. This improvised heater had limits. It could not warm a room nor save men from freezing blizzards. It was fragile, easily extinguished, and dangerous if tipped over. But pressed against hands, slipped beneath blankets, or placed beneath a small shelter, it extended endurance just enough to matter. What made it powerful was not the size of the flame, but the hope it carried. A tin glowing faintly in the corner of a trench reminded men they were not entirely helpless. Even in the most desolate places, they could carve out a pocket of warmth, however small, however fragile. Would you trust a candle in a can to hold back the cold? Sometimes survival is not about conquering the storm, but finding a way to last one more night inside it. Number 7. Oilcloth glove liners. The cold didn't just sting during World War II. It crippled. Fingers froze stiff, rifles slipped from numb hands, and frostbite spread silently until men could no longer fight. Proper gloves were scarce, often torn or lost, and replacements never came. Soldiers had to improvise or accept that winter would claim them before the enemy did. The solution came from an old trick of farmers and fishermen: oiling cloth to repel moisture and trap heat. Strips of fabric were coated in animal fat, cooking grease, or even wax scraped from leftover candles. Once dried and hardened, these makeshift oilcloths were cut into liners and slipped inside threadbare gloves. Suddenly, fabric that once soaked through in minutes became a barrier against wet snow and icy wind. The process was simple, but demanded patience. Cloth was saturated thoroughly, rubbed until every fiber carried a thin layer of grease. Some soldiers pressed the fabric against warm stones, so the oil soaked deeper, binding into the weave. Others layered 2 or 3 pieces, stitching them crudely together before sliding them into their gloves. The oily texture wasn't pleasant, but the effect was immediate. Warmth held longer, skin stayed drier, and circulation improved. There were drawbacks. The smell of rancid fat clung to the fabric, attracting insects when weather changed. Liners stiffened over time, cracking if not reheated and re-oiled. And they were never perfect. Fingers still numbed after hours, only more slowly. Yet in trenches, forests, and mountain passes, these crude barriers gave men just enough endurance to hold a weapon, dig a foxhole, or signal a comrade. More than a trick, it was resilience woven into fabric. By transforming scraps into shields, soldiers proved survival wasn't about waiting for supplies. It was about reshaping what little remained. Would you slip your hands into something greasy, smelly, and rough if it meant keeping them alive? In war, they didn't hesitate, because survival was never about comfort. It was about lasting one more day in a world determined to take everything away. They endured with almost nothing. No stores, no safety nets, no certainty that the next sunrise would bring food or warmth. Yet through ingenuity, they transformed ashes, rags, mud, and metal scraps into lifelines. Every hidden method was proof that survival isn't about what you own. It's about what you know. Today, we live in comfort, mistaking convenience for permanence. We trust grids, shelves, and pipelines that feel unshakable until the moment they collapse. When that day comes, no app, no delivery, no waiting line will save you. What will matter are the skills burned into memory, the knowledge carried when the world offers nothing else. The soldiers of World War II left us more than stories. They left us survival codes, fragile, powerful, nearly forgotten. The choice now is simple. Let those lessons vanish or reclaim them before it's too late. If you believe resilience should never be lost, if you want to be prepared, not dependent, then subscribe now and stand with the generation that remembers what the world tried to forget.